It was an adventure strip. Comedy was what cartoons did. No one had ever done a serious cartoon.
Each one is written, edited, performed, directed, scored, and lit as if it was actually happening.
Everything that they did in those cartoons is stuff that we're still building on.
So much of the Superman mythos is in those cartoons. I think those, more than anything, established Superman as the icon he is today.
My father was a pioneer in animation and a great innovator, great artist, and really gave cartoons the movement and flexibility that we see today.
I think then, as now, you have your A-list animation studios and your B. And at the time, I think that, you had Disney, of course, was always the tops. But the Fleischers were number two, really, throughout the 30s, with the Warner's cartoons coming up very fast.
The Fleischer studio consisted of Max as the producer and his brother Dave, the director, and another brother was in the sound department and the music department, and they had brothers all over. Max Fleischer was a cartoonist in the early part of the 20th century, and he also liked to invent things. He was an inventor. And in fact, at one point he was the art editor of Popular Science magazine.
So when he got wind of animation, which of course in the early teens was in a very crude beginning stage, it seemed to be a perfect marriage of all of his interests, of the science, the technology, and the art, and the cartooning.
It wasn't just cartooning, it was using mechanics and technology to make cartoons move.
As the studio developed, Max let his focus be the technical aspects of the animation. After a cartoon was finished, Max would often screen the film, and Max would say, well, now, boys, you could have done this here, and the animators looked upon him as a father figure, whose advice they really valued.
Max, of course, was a perfect gentleman all the time. I never heard him raise his voice. And they were a very talented family, each one of them. Dave, I consider him the best gag man I ever knew.
Dave Fleischer really enjoyed the storytelling aspects, and as director would discuss ideas and gags, so the two were actually a perfect match.
Max came up with this idea, which was, he thought, a cheaper way to make cartoons, which would be to photograph live action and then trace over it.
He invented a machine called a rotoscope, which is still in use in every special effects house in the world. And that made a complete change in the look of animation.
He used it to make his first series of cartoons, Coco the Clown, and that put him in business. He actually had a cartoon series in movie theaters, Out of the Inkwell.
The clown appeared as a cartoon along with my father, who was live action, and the two played together and had adventures together. But his most popular creation is Betty Boop, and Betty Boop's still going strong. He produced the Popeyes. He brought Popeye from the comic strip onto the screen, where the character became even more popular than it did as a comic strip cartoon.
Babe, I'll stick to you like glue.
The feeling is mucilage.
The Fleischers felt like they were doing stuff that they lived or that they saw in the streets. It had more of like a vaudevillian or burlesque kind of quality to it. They were really earthy and street.
They didn't have college degrees. These guys came from the city, from the Bronx, and they had city humor. And the Popeye cartoons and the Betty Boop cartoons reflect this New York City sense of humor, which the guys out on the West Coast, the Looney Tunes guys and the Disney guys, they were all highbrow.
Lois, the old island looks just as good as ever.
That's right, Clark. Thanks to Superman.
Popeye was, of course, adapted from a comic strip, and that was working for them. And the biggest comic strip to come out of the late 30s was Superman. Paramount got Superman and gave it to the Fleischer studio. The Fleischers didn't want to do the Superman cartoons.
The story that Dave told was that to dissuade Paramount from the difficulty of doing such a project, he asked them for an enormous amount of money.
They knew it would be a huge challenge, and they didn't want to do it. And Dave outright, no, let's not do this. So he threw a number at Paramount that he never thought they would accept. And Paramount went, okay, let's do it. I guess they realized that Superman was that powerful and that big a presence because they were really gambling on the success of Superman.
You know, they were very, very expensive cartoons for the day. They were doing things that nobody had ever really done before in cartoons. There was a lot of movement and crowd scenes and vehicles, you know, crashing into each other and buildings toppling over, and it all had to look real.
When the Fleischer brothers started doing Superman, they were faced with the challenge of not only animating a character that was very popular in the comics, but also keeping it very true to that world, which was a serious world.
The Superman comics had only been out for a few years at the time they did the cartoons. It looks very, very realistic and very, very believable.
Superman!
Are you all right?
Yes, for the moment, but
The designs of the characters, Lois and Clark and Superman himself, they're all very, very faithful to the look that Siegel and Schuster came up with for the comic.
They also had to come up with a style. Back in the 30s, adventure fiction that was sold on newsstands before comic books was pulp magazines. Magazines that sold adventures, Western stories, detective stories, heroic stories like The Spider and The Shadow. And they had these great lurid covers, beautifully painted, of dramatic incidents. And if you look at those pulp covers and you look at the first Superman cartoons, you can see that they were taking that feel of the pulp magazine and they were transposing it to the animated cartoon.